My name is Michael Thompson. I have 46 years old, and I'm from Salt Lake City, Utah. For over 20 years, I have believed with all my heart that Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints was the true Church of God. I lived to serve, obey, and defend that faith until the day I saw something that shattered everything I thought I knew about love and compassion. That's when I saw how they treated my sick mother, a woman of unshakable faith, within the very walls we called the house of the Lord. From that moment on, I understood that there are things that religion cannot justify, and that, sometimes, the greatest test of faith is having the courage to see the truth. Comment your city and country so I know how far my voice is reaching. Leave your like if you believe that faith should never erase compassion and sign up to hear real stories of faith and spiritual awakening. I grew up believing my family was the epitome of faith. Every Sunday, we would put on our best clothes and head to the temple together, Bibles in hand and hearts filled with hope. My father always said that serving the prophet was serving God himself, and I believed this with all the innocence of a child raised in the church. Life revolved around meetings, fasts, conferences, and songs that echoed like promises of salvation. Every gesture, every prayer, felt like another step toward heaven. My mother was the silent pillar of it all, a woman of unwavering faith, always smiling, always willing to help anyone in need. She cooked for missionaries, sewed clothes for the needy, and spent nights praying for people who never knew her name. She believed that the Lord healed through obedience, and that every trial was a reminder of God's love. Our home seemed perfect. The dinner table was filled with gratitude, and my father's voice guided prayers with authority. I felt protected, part of something greater. A sense of purpose united us all. Faith was our language, and the temple, our refuge. Nothing seemed to threaten that harmony until my mother's health began to fail. At first, no one wanted to believe it was anything serious. "It's just fatigue," they said. But as the months passed, the light in her eyes dimmed. Still, she insisted on serving. Even weak, she made a point of attending meetings, preparing meals for the missionaries, and smiling when her body gave out. "God will give me strength," she repeated. I saw her bend in pain and, even then, bend her knees to pray. It was during this period that I began to notice something strange. The more she suffered, the more distant the church seemed. Visits diminished, words of comfort turned to cold advice. They said the illness was a spiritual test, a test of faith. My father accepted it in silence, and I, without understanding, tried to believe that this abandonment was part of the divine plan. I remember one night in particular. My mother, lying in bed, looked at me and said, "Son, God is listening to me, even if no one else is." In that moment, something inside me broke. I began to question what it truly meant to serve God. How could a church that preached love and compassion turn its back on a woman who gave her life for her faith? What had once been pride in being part of the church began to turn into discomfort. I watched my mother wither away, and the answers we received were always the same. Pray more, trust in the priesthood, accept the Lord's will. It was as if her suffering were taboo, something that tarnished the image of perfection everyone strove to maintain. Over time, the home that once seemed sacred became a space of silence and resignation. Prayers now contained tears. The faith that once united us began to isolate us. I watched my father's expression harden, perhaps out of fear, perhaps out of helplessness. And deep down, I understood. He too had been taught to obey, not to feel. Even in the face of pain, my mother never lost her faith. "The Lord heals, but first He teaches," she would say, holding my hand with trembling fingers. That phrase remained etched in my soul, and only years later did. I realized that what she called healing would not come from the temple, but from the truth. This was the first crack in the wall of perfection that surrounded my family. The beginning of a journey that would lead me to see what no one wanted to see, that behind the appearance of holiness lay human hearts, fragile and flawed. And that sometimes, true love for God begins when we stop pretending everything is right. My mother believed that the Lord healed through obedience. I learned from her that the Lord frees through the truth. My mother has always been the heart of our faith. Even when her body was no longer responding, she insisted on getting up early, putting on her best dress, and following me to church. God sees everything, son, she would say with a weary smile, and every pain has a purpose. Her words carried the weight of eternity and the lightness of someone who believes, without needing to understand. While many sought excuses to miss services, she found the strength to sing in choirs, help with missionary lunches, and prepare meals for families in need. I remember seeing her leaning her frail body on the church pew, her voice trembling but firm, singing hymns of faith. Each note felt like a plea for healing, not just for her, but for everyone. She was a woman who believed that to serve was to love. If she saw someone in need, she reached out. If she knew someone was suffering, she prayed. When her illness advanced and the days became more difficult, she simply said, "The Lord is teaching me patience." Even as a young woman, I saw in her a strength that bordered on the impossible. It seemed her faith held the entire house together. But gradually I noticed something that disturbed me. The church, which had spoken so much of charity and love, began to withdraw. Visits diminished. The leaders, once so present, now only sent messages of faith and perseverance. The community that had once called itself a spiritual family now acted as if illness were an inconvenient matter, something that tarnished the perfect image of holiness. My mother never complained. Even weakened, she would say, "They have their struggles too. Maybe the Lord is asking me to pray for them." This was her way of transforming abandonment into forgiveness. But a silent pain grew inside me, a sense of injustice I couldn't yet name. One Sunday she tried to sing, but her voice cracked. Still, she raised her hands and smiled. No one noticed that she nearly fainted at the end of the hymn. Some looked, others looked away, and the service continued as if nothing had happened. I drove her home, and on the way she whispered, "Don't cry, son. The Lord has seen." In that moment, I realized that her faith was greater than the institution that ignored her. As the months passed, her illness progressed. The church never lacked words, only presence. "Let's pray for her," they sighed, but rarely showed up. No leader offered to take her to the doctor, nor asked if we needed help. It was as if her suffering had become invisible. One day, I went to the bishop for support. He said my mother needed comfort, perhaps a blessing. He responded with a serenity that froze me. "Perhaps the Lord is preparing you for something greater. It's best you accept God's will." That phrase, spoken so calmly, sounded like a sentence. I left the temple with my soul torn, unsure whether I believed more in the God who healed or the God who allowed it. But my mother, she kept praying. Every night, even in pain, she knelt beside her bed. She prayed for us, for the church, even for those who had forgotten her. "The love of Christ is not to be understood. It is to be lived," she would say. And I saw the light of faith persist in her eyes, even when her body could no longer bear it. It was during this time that I began to understand what it truly means to be of God. Realize that my mother, with her quiet humility, was closer to the divine than all those who preached from the pulpit. While others spoke of faith, she lived it. While others quoted scripture, she embodied love. And yet, the emptiness of the church's absence hurt. The people who once called us brothers now avoided us. Perhaps not out of malice, but out of fear of seeing what is human, what is flawed, what is real. The temple, which once symbolized solace, began to represent distance. I remember the last day she was able to leave the house to go to church. She was weak, but she insisted, "I want to sing one last hymn." As her voice echoed in the hall, I realized it wasn't just a hymn, it was a farewell. No one there seemed to grasp the enormity of what was happening. Only I knew she was giving herself completely, not to the church, but to God. God sees everything, and every pain has a purpose. These were her words before she closed her eyes that night. Today, I understand that. The purpose was not to test faith, it was to reveal the truth. That genuine faith does not depend on the approval of men, but on compassion that springs from the heart. The church forgot her, but God didn't, and I never forgot either. My mother's illness advanced slowly, like a shadow swallowing the days of hope. Each morning seemed heavier, each breath shorter. Even so, she still believed that faith could move mountains. She asked for prayers, asked for blessings, and waited for divine touch through the hands of church leaders. But what she received were rehearsed, cold, distant words, the kind of comfort that doesn't heal, only silences. The bishop came once, his expression calm and his voice controlled. After a brief prayer, he said, "Perhaps the Lord is testing your faith. Sometimes suffering is a blessing in disguise." I remember looking at my mother and seeing in her eyes a mixture of pain and resignation. She didn't argue, just smiled humbly and replied, "If it is His will, so be it." When the bishop left, the silence that remained was so thick it felt like a wall. Over time the visits ceased. The phone calls became rare. When I asked if anyone from the church would come, my father would just shake his head, saying the leaders were busy with spiritual matters. My mother, already having difficulty walking, still waited. "They will come," she said with faith. But no one came. The nights grew long. I heard her muffled prayers, asking for strength to keep believing. "Lord, if this is your will, give me peace." I watched her and felt anger, not at God, but at those who used His name as a shield for indifference. Her faith was alive, but the institution around her seemed dead. One afternoon, my mother asked the bishop to come again. She was weak, with a high fever, and wanted a blessing. He didn't show up. He sent a message, "Tell her to pray more fervently. Sometimes the body suffers when the spirit needs to be purified." Those words stuck in my mind like a cave wound. How could someone who preached love respond so to a woman who only knew kindness? It was then that I realized the kind of faith they cultivated. A bureaucratic, soulless faith, where every gesture was measured by rules and appearances. My mother didn't need sermons. She needed compassion. But in those days, the church seemed more concerned with reputations than hearts. Each week, she lost a little more strength. She could no longer climb the temple steps, so she listened to the services through the window, trying to quietly sing the hymns she loved so much. "Even from here, God hears me," she would say. I held her hand and pretended to leave, but something inside me was already beginning to die along with my faith. In one of his last attempts, my father took her to the temple in a wheelchair. People looked on with pity, but no one approached. The bishop greeted her briefly, and then turned to attend to another member. She smiled, as if that were enough. But when we got home, he wept silently. I had never seen my mother cry. It was the first and last time. Institutional abandonment became evident. The church that preached that no one is left behind left my mother alone at a time when she needed it most. No words of sincere comfort. No gesture of empathy, just ready-made phrases, delivered with the coldness of someone more afraid of breaking protocol than of breaking a person's heart. As she lost strength, they made excuses. They said it might be a trial, a punishment, or a lack of faith. Each excuse was an elegant way to distance themselves from the pain and to keep the image of perfection intact. The temple had become a mirror. It reflected only what they wanted to see. The last time I asked the bishop if my mother could receive a blessing of healing, he replied, "Son, perhaps her healing is in the next life." Those words sounded like a final sentence. I returned home to find my mother lying there, staring at the ceiling. "He said I will be healed, but not here." She smiled, and I knew she already knew. The following days were the longest of my life. Her faith remained, but now it was a silent, intimate, almost secret faith, a direct conversation with God, without intermediaries. When her body no longer responded, she simply closed her eyes and said, "I still trust." Today, when I reflect on that period, I realize that my mother represented the purest form of faith. She never gave up, even when the church gave up on her. It was there, in sickness and silence, that I learned what it truly means to have faith, not the faith of rhetoric, but the faith that survives abandonment. As she lost strength, they gained excuses. And it was in this chasm between faith and indifference that my soul began to awaken. As my mother's illness worsened, our home was already a silent battlefield. Each night was a struggle for her to breathe without pain, and each morning began with the hope that someone from the church would come, a leader, a sister of charity, anyone who would show a little compassion. But time passed, and silence was the only answer. My father, a man of faith and respect, then decided to seek out the bishop. He entered his office with weary eyes and a heart filled with humility. He asked for help, not just financial, but human. "My wife is suffering. We need support, visits, someone to pray with us," he said, trying to hide his choked voice. The bishop, with a serene expression and his hands folded on the table, replied, "Pray more, brother. Trust in the priesthood. God tests those he loves." Those words echoed through the house like a sentence. It was as if my mother's pain were a test we had to face alone. She listened to the answer in silence, and simply said, "Then let's pray more, son." I wanted to scream. I wanted to ask, where was that love they preached so much from the pulpits? Where was the Christ who told us to care for the sick and comfort the afflicted? The following days were marked by broken promises. The bishop said he would send someone to visit her, but no one showed. Calls to priesthood leaders were answered with automated phrases. "We are praying for her. The Lord knows what he is doing. Have faith." The same words, repeated as a shield against responsibility. I remember one afternoon when my mother, pale-faced and short of breath, asked if the missionaries would come to sing for her. I lied. I said they would come on Sunday. She got ready, put on her favorite scarf, and waited all day. None of them came. That night, she simply said, "Maybe God is asking me for patience." And I, helpless, choked back tears so as not to break her faith. At that time, I still believed the church was a family, but I began to realize that their faith ended where the suffering of others began. With each cry for help, the response was the same: more prayer, more submission, more silence. And the more we obeyed, the more alone we became. My father tried one last time. He went to the stake president, asking for help with the medicine we could no longer afford. The answer came cold, shrouded in pity and formality. "Church resources are for spiritual causes, brother. The Lord will provide what is needed if it is his will." I watched my father leave with his eyes downcast, carrying on his shoulders not only the weight of poverty, but also of shame. At home, he simply said, "They asked us to trust more." My mother smiled, trying to ease his pain. "We will," but deep down we all knew what that word meant: abandonment. The missionaries stopped coming to the house. The Relief Society sisters, who had previously called frequently, stopped asking. The phone, once full of "God bless you" messages, now remained silent. And it was in this silence that my mother began to fade, not just physically, but emotionally. The faith that had always been her strength began to transform into a lonely refuge. One night, she called me into her room. In a weak voice, she asked, "Son, has God forgotten me?" Those words cut to my heart. I held her hand and said, "No, Mother. It's men who have forgotten." She closed her eyes and whispered, "Then pray for them too. Even sick, even abandoned, she still had compassion for those who had cast her aside." It was then that I began to see clearly the stark contrast between doctrine and practice. The church preached love, but the love it preached didn't reach the temple. They talked about Christ, but the Christ I knew didn't live there. He was by my mother's side, between 4 drips and tears, silently supporting her. Over time, I learned that faith isn't measured by the number of prayers, but by the ability to see others. And during that time, I realized that institutional faith had become a mask beautiful in public, but empty on the inside. My mother kept saying, "God sees everything," and I, who had previously believed the leader's words, now believed hers. Because if the God they followed could ignore a woman dying in prayer, then my mother's God was different, more human, more real. While she lost strength, they gained excuses. That phrase was etched in me like a scar. It was the moment I understood that the true miracle was not the healing of the body, but the awakening of the soul. My mother, with her silent faith and unconditional love, showed me what the church could never teach. That true love is not preached, it is practiced. That Sunday began like so many others with the same old ritual. My mother waking up early, striving to appear strong, even when her body barely obeyed her. She insisted on going to church, saying she wanted to see the Lord before seeing the doctor. I tried to convince her to stay home, but she responded with a smile that hid pain. "Son, my faith still has legs, even if mine don't." And then, leaning on my arm, we walked slowly to the temple. The sun was beating down when we arrived, and I remember the heavy air inside the chapel, the sound of hymns, the murmur of prayers, solemn voices of the leaders from the pulpit. My mother looked radiant, even though pale, as if her mere presence in that place restored her strength. We sat in the back row, and she held the hymnal with trembling hands. When the choir began, her weak voice blended with the melody. It was beautiful and sad at the same time, like a prayer whispered into the void. During the sacrament, I noticed her trembling. Sweat ran down her forehead, and she struggled to appear steadfast. I looked around, hoping someone would notice. There were deacons passing the bread and water, brothers and sisters reverently, but no one seemed to see. It was as if her pain didn't exist there, as if it were invisible within the house of God. Then something happened. When she tried to stand to sing the next hymn, her legs gave out. She fell to her knees, trying to steady herself on the pew, and the hymnal slipped from her hands and fell to the floor. The sound echoed through the hall, and for a moment, silence fell over the congregation. Everyone looked, but no one moved. I immediately stood up, grabbed her, and called for help. "Please, someone help us," I shouted. The bishop, sitting in the front, just watched. One of the counselors came to me, and in a low voice said, "Brother, please take her to the aisle. We don't want to cause a disturbance during the service." Those words pierced me like a knife. The commotion was what they feared most, not the pain, not the suffering, but the discomfort of the perfect image being tarnished by reality. I carried my mother outside, feeling the weight of her body weaken in my arms. In the hallway, she wept softly. "I'm sorry, son. I just wanted to sing." I saw my mother cry inside the house of God, and no one reached out. People passed by us and looked away. Some pretended not to see, others said coldly, "Let's pray for her." The bishop appeared briefly in the doorway, placed his hand on my father's shoulder and said, "Let her rest a little. Perhaps she needs to strengthen her spirit." and he returned to the pulpit as if nothing had happened. We sat there on the hallway floor as the service continued. The sound of the hymns and voices was muffled, as if coming from another world. The temple, which had always been a symbol of love and community, now felt empty, soulless. And for the first time, I didn't feel God's presence there. After a few minutes, I helped my mother stand. She insisted on returning to the hall. "I want to hear it all," she said in a small voice. We returned. People silently parted, but no one offered help. She sat back down, adjusted her headscarf, and tried to smile. Tears were still streaming, but she brushed them away discreetly, as if she didn't want to disturb anyone. When the bishop returned to the pulpit, he delivered a sermon on the strength of faith in times of trial. He spoke with such authority that it seemed he believed the suffering he had ignored minutes before was merely a spiritual lesson. Mother listened attentively, as if still seeking comfort in his words. I, on the other hand, felt only anger. With each sentence he spoke, I wondered, what kind of faith demands silence in the face of pain? What kind of love chooses who deserves care, and who should be left behind? The service ended. People approached the bishop to shake his hand and thank him for his beautiful speech. No one came to speak to my mother. No compassionate glances, no sincere words. Just formalities restrained, smiles, and a strange rush to get out of there. On the way home, she held my hand and said, "Don't judge, son. They don't understand." And I asked, my voice trembling, "But Mom, does God understand?" She was silent. After a while she replied, "God always understands. But sometimes men confuse him with themselves." That sentence stuck with me. It was the moment I realized my mother still believed, but I didn't. That night I sat on the porch, looking up at the sky and trying to make sense of it. The temple, the prayers, the hymns, it all seemed distant, as if from another life. And then I understood. The faith I'd been taught had crumbled before the altar, not because God had failed, but because the men who spoke in his name had forgotten who he truly was. That day marked the end of one belief and the birth of another, no longer in the church, but in the love I saw in my mother, even when she was ignored. She, weak and forgotten, showed more divinity in one tear than all those leaders in their sermons. And that's how I understood that the true temple of God has no walls. It lives in the hands that reach out, in the tears that are wiped away, and in the courage to not turn away from pain. That was the day everything changed. The day I saw the naked, unvarnished truth inside the house of God. And since then, I've never been able to pray with my eyes closed again. After that day in the temple, something inside me broke, and the sound of that break echoed for a long time. I returned home, my body present, but my soul distant. The images of that morning replayed in my mind like an endless film. My mother fallen, the indifferent gaze of the people, the bishop asking me not to cause a commotion. It didn't feel like the house of God. It felt like a theater of faith, where real suffering was treated as a misdirection. That night I lay in bed, but sleep wouldn't come. The room was dark, and yet I could see everything clearly: my mother's face, the cold floor of the temple, the eyes of those who pretended not to see. I tried to pray, but the words froze. When I did, my voice came out trembling, almost childlike. "God, show me you're still here." And all I heard was silence, a heavy, deep, almost deafening silence. I spent days trying to understand. How could a church that preached love and charity turn its back on a woman who dedicated her entire life to service? How could leaders who spoke of Christ act so coldly in the face of human pain? "Perhaps it's a trial," some said. "Perhaps the Lord wants to strengthen your faith." But I could no longer believe it. Because if my mother's suffering was a lesson, then what kind of teacher was this God who allowed such neglect? The nights became a battlefield. I fought against thoughts I'd never dared to entertain. I felt guilty for doubting, but also ashamed for believing for so long without questioning. My mind spun in circles. What if this is all a mistake? What if the truth I've been taught is just a narrative to control people's fears? These questions haunted me. My mother, even though weak, continued to pray. Sometimes I would see her staring into space, murmuring words that seemed to come from another world. One night, I sat beside her and asked, "Mother, why do you still pray?" She responded tenderly, "Because God's silence is also an answer, my son. Sometimes He is silent so that people can reveal their true selves." That struck me like a revelation. I discovered that sometimes God's silence is the cry of truth. But even with this answer, the pain didn't subside. Every Sunday, when I heard the church bells, I felt a lump in my throat. I could no longer enter that temple without feeling something was wrong. The same altar that once inspired me now repelled me. Every prayer that rose from it seemed empty, meant to be heard more by men than by God. I began to avoid meetings. People looked at me suspiciously, some commenting that my faith was weak. The bishop, upon hearing about it, came to my house. He sat down with me and said, "Brother, understand that sometimes we need to accept God's plan, even without understanding it." I looked him in the eye and asked, "What if it's not God's plan, but rather human carelessness?" He didn't answer. He smiled slightly, changed the subject, and left, saying he would pray for me. It was the first time I felt spiritually alone, not because God had abandoned me, but because the institution that claimed to speak for Him had lost its voice. The God had abandoned me, but because the institution that claimed to speak for Him had lost its voice. Faith I'd been taught, the one built on obedience and hierarchy, began to crumble like a sandcastle. I began reading, studying, and listening to stories from others who also felt betrayed by the church. I discovered that my experience was not unique. There were entire families destroyed by hidden secrets, by leaders who preferred protecting the institution's image to protecting the flock. And the more I read, the clearer it became. The problem wasn't God. It was the men who stood between Him and us. One night I left home and walked to the empty temple. I sat on the steps and stared at the glowing lights inside. The cold wind blew, and I cried like a lost child. I asked for a sign, anything. A touch, a word, a whisper. But again, the silence. And in that silence, for the first time, I felt something different. It wasn't absence. It was as if God were saying to me, "Now it's you who needs to speak." That silence turned into strength. Little by little, I realized that faith hadn't died. It had simply changed location. It no longer lived in the temple, in the hands of the leaders, nor in the repeated words of the speeches. Faith now lived in my mother's eyes, in the dignity of her pain, in the certainty that true love doesn't need human recognition to be divine. Even so, doubt still haunted me. Some days I felt anger, others only sadness. There was a gaping wound between what I believed and what I saw. I spent sleepless nights replaying every moment of my life within the church, the promises, the sermons, the smiles. It all seemed like a carefully orchestrated ploy to hide the humanity of those who claimed to be saints. But it was in this pain that I began to awaken. I understood that faith is not blind obedience, and that God never wanted servants who kneel before men. He wanted children who walk with conscience and pure hearts. And although I still didn't have all the answers, I found something more valuable, the courage to question. Because perhaps the true miracle isn't hearing God's voice, but having the courage to keep seeking even when He's silent. At that stage in my life, silence ceased to be emptiness and became a mirror. And in the reflection, I saw the truth that had always been there. God wasn't in the temple that ignored my mother. He was in me, in love, in pain, and in the decision to never again turn a blind eye to injustice in the name of faith. After months of trying to suppress the pain, something inside me began to shift. I could no longer accept the idea that all of this my mother's illness, the abandonment of the church, the silence of the leaders was simply a divine trial. I needed to understand. I needed to know if what we had experienced was an exception ... or if there were more people hurt by the same system that had taught us never to question. I started slowly. I searched the church's name online, along with words I never imagined typing. Spiritual abuse, control, former members. The first stories I found seemed to echo my own. People who had given their lives to their faith, served for decades, and when they needed love most, received only silence. I read testimonies of forgotten widows, exhausted missionaries, mothers who had lost children and been told to accept the Lord's will. But the Lord's will, I realized, always seemed to coincide with the leader's convenience. It was like opening an old wound. Each story hit me hard, but it also freed me. I realized that my mother wasn't the only one. Forgotten many were hurt in the name of obedience. Faith, used as a tool of comfort, could also be used as a shackle. In former member groups, I began talking to people who had stories nearly identical to ours. One woman told me that her husband, also a bishop, was removed when she became ill. They told him to focus on the priesthood, not on caring for a weak wife. Another reported that her stake president guilt-tripped her for taking antidepressants, saying that sadness is a lack of faith. Each new conversation showed me a pattern. Compassion, which should be the center of doctrine, had been replaced by the appearance of holiness. It was painful, but also revealing. I, who had previously seen the church as the only path to God, began to understand that His presence was never limited to a building, a title, or a hierarchy. God wasn't confined to that church. He was in the love they had forgotten. I remember one rainy afternoon, rereading an old letter from my mother. She had written it shortly before she passed away, but had never given it to me. On the envelope, in her shaky handwriting, was a simple sentence: "If you ever doubt, seek truth, not fear." I cried as I read it. She knew. Even without the strength to fight the system, she intuited that God's true love was not found in blind obedience, but in the freedom to love without conditions. From that day forward, my search shifted from answers to meaning. I read books by former leaders who abandoned the structure and rebuilt their faith. I watched interviews, documentaries, and listened to testimonies from those who dared to leave and start over. And in each voice, I heard the same wound and the same hope. That's how I understood what had truly happened to my mother. She didn't die simply from the disease, but from the spiritual loneliness inflicted upon her. The abandonment of the church wounded more than her body, it wounded her soul. And this abandonment came not from God, but from men who mistook power for holiness. I started writing about it. At first, just for myself, small rants in a notebook she'd given me. But little by little, I realized I needed to share. That what we'd experienced couldn't be just another story buried under fear. Writing became a form of healing. Each word was a different prayer, not asking for anything, just thanking for finally seeing. It was in this process that I realized something profound. For years, I sought God in altars, temples, and scriptures. But He was always present in the simplest places, in the hands that care, in the eyes that weep with another, in the forgiveness that requires no explanation. My mother always knew this. While the leaders preached obedience, she practiced compassion. While the bishop spoke of faith, she lived love. I began to revisit childhood memories, the days she would bring food to neighbors, even though she had little at home. The time she sewed clothes for missionaries without anyone knowing. The time she would say, "God doesn't need applause, only kindness." And then I understood. My mother was more Christian in her suffering than many leaders in their pulpits. This awakening didn't come without pain. Even today, there are days when I find myself looking back with anger, wishing I had done something different. But anger soon gives way to gratitude, because if it weren't for the pain, I might never have known the truth. And the truth is that love is greater than any church. No man has a monopoly on faith, and no title guarantees purity. True faith is not in those who speak the loudest, but in those who love in silence. One day, I went to visit the cemetery where my mother is buried. I brought simple flowers, just as she liked. I sat beside the headstone and said, "Mom, now I understand." The wind blew, and for a moment I felt a peace that came not from outside, but from within. There was no more fear, no more guilt. There was only the certainty that, even though forgotten by the church, she was never forgotten by God. At that moment, I realized my faith journey wasn't over. It had just changed direction. I had left behind the religion of men to rediscover the spirituality my mother had always lived. Today, when I think of her, I see her not as a victim of a cold institution, but as a silent messenger of a God who dwells not in stone temples, but in hearts that choose to love. And this is the greatest discovery anyone can make, that divine truth is not written in manuals, but imprinted in compassion. It was in this awakening that I found freedom, freedom to feel, question, forgive, and move on. And now, when I look to the sky, I no longer ask for signs or miracles. I simply give thanks, because I finally understood that God never abandoned me. He just waited for me to open my eyes. Time passed, but the wounds left by that period didn't heal immediately. There were years of silence, of nights when I woke feeling as if I were still inside that temple, surrounded by cold stares and empty prayers. The image of my mother, kneeling and ignored, came back to me whenever I heard someone talk about Christian love. It seemed ironic. For a long time, I associated the name of God with pain, and any memory of the church made me feel a weight on my chest. But slowly, something inside me began to change. Hatred tires, anger consumes. And I realized that if I continued to hold on to the hurt, I would become like those who hurt my mother, incapable of loving with purity. It was then that I understood that forgiveness is not a gift for those who hurt us, but for those who long to breathe again. I forgave, not because they deserved it, but because I needed to breathe again. This forgiveness didn't come overnight. It was a slow, almost invisible process, made up of small decisions, deciding not to respond with hate, deciding to listen, deciding not to close my heart. I began participating in support groups formed by former members. There I met people who carried stories as difficult as mine. Men and women who had lost families, friends, homes, but who, even wounded, still sought God without intermediaries, without luxurious temples, without fear. In these conversations, I learned that I was not alone, that there were many sons and daughters of forgotten mothers, like mine, who had suffered in silence. And it was in this sharing that I found healing. Pain, when shared, ceases to be a prison and becomes a bridge. I discovered that speaking liberates, but being heard saves. There was an elderly man who always said something I've never forgotten. Religion can teach us to pray, but only pain teaches us to understand what love is. This phrase became a guide for me. I began to see God not as a judge, but as a patient father, who doesn't punish those who fall. He extends his hand to those who rise. I began visiting different communities, without labels, without dogma. I was welcomed by people who didn't ask me, "What church are you in?" but "How are you?" There I realized what true compassion is. The name of the faith didn't matter, but the presence of love. And the more I saw kindness outside the institution, the more I realized how absent it was within it. One day, I decided to visit the ancient temple again, not out of nostalgia, but for closure. I entered the courtyard and sat on the same bench where my mother had once nearly fainted. I closed my eyes and let the memories come. I felt pain, but also gratitude. Because without that suffering, I might still be blind, believing that God dwells only where men say he does. As I stood there, an elderly woman passed by and recognized me. It was a sister who had known my mother. She came over, put her hand on my shoulder, and said, "Your mother was a saint." The church should have treated her better. Her words were simple, but they carried something I hadn't heard in years: humanity. I smiled, and in that instant I felt a profound peace, as if my mother were smiling through her. Healing came not with miracles, but with understanding. I learned to separate God from institutions. I discovered that faith is a flame that no authority can extinguish, and that true temples are made of flesh, not stone. My mother died believing in God, and I still believe in him, but no longer in them. Today, when I think of forgiveness, I don't see faces, I see freedom, because forgiveness isn't about forgetting what happened. It's about stopping letting the past control the present. I still remember what they did, the coldness, the empty words, the abandonment, but now those memories don't paralyze me. They remind me of who I don't want to be. I realize there's something sacred even in pain. It's pain that shaped me, that opened my eyes, that brought me closer to the real God, the God who doesn't hide behind titles, who doesn't demand perfection, who doesn't measure faith by obedience, but by compassion. The God I saw in my mother's eyes when she forgave those who forgot her. I'm often asked if I would return to the church. I answer calmly, no, because the faith I found outside of it is greater than the one I lost within. There, I learned to fear. Here, I learned to love. I also learned that true religion is caring, seeing others, even when they have nothing to offer. It's not needing a pulpit to do good. It's understanding that the most powerful prayer is the gesture of reaching out. Today, I live with ease. Not because I've forgotten, but because I've transformed pain into purpose. My mother's story wasn't in vain. She taught me that love, when it's true, doesn't depend on recognition, and that God continues to speak, even when the church is silent. When the sun sets and I miss her so much, I look up at the sky again, as I did with her. I close my eyes and say, "Mother, now I understand. The faith you left me is greater than the religion that hurt us." And the light wind that touches my face reminds me that she is never completely gone, that the love of a righteous soul remains, even when the body rests. This is my healing, finding peace without forgetting, and love without needing dogma. I forgave, not to clear anyone's name, but to lift the weight from my heart. And in the end, this is what my mother always wanted, for me to breathe, for me to live, for me to believe. Today, I believe, not in the perfection of humankind, but in the goodness that still exists. And when I look back, I know that that painful chapter was the beginning of my true faith, a faith that doesn't fit in temples, but fits entirely in a free heart. Today, after everything I've experienced, I can finally speak without fear. I speak with a voice that was once silenced by blind respect for authority. I speak with the heart of one who saw faith used as a tool of power. And I speak above all for my mother, and for all those who have been forgotten by religion, but remembered by God. She didn't have the chance to be heard, but I do. And that's why this story isn't just mine. It belongs to all those who once believed and were betrayed by the indifference of those who claimed to act in the name of the Lord. For a long time, I thought silence was synonymous with faith, that enduring in silence was proof of obedience. But I learned that silence in the face of injustice is the opposite of faith. It is fear. And fear does not come from God. True faith does not bow before error. It exposes it to the light. Today, I seek neither revenge nor applause. I seek awareness, because the truth that liberates hurts first, but then heals. My mother died believing in God, and I continue to believe in Him, but now with open eyes. I believe in the God who doesn't demand perfection, but compassion. In the God who doesn't demand gilded temples, but honest hearts. In the God who doesn't condemn those who ask, but blesses those who seek. It was this God I found outside the walls of the church. And it was He who taught me that faith doesn't require silence, it requires courage. For years, I heard leaders say that to question was to doubt God. Today I know that questioning is the purest form of faith, because only those who believe in divine love are capable of confronting human lies. True faith is not blind, it is compassionate. It protects itself not with fear, but with love. It is sustained not by obedience, but by truth. As I write these words, I feel my mother is with me. I can almost hear her soft voice saying, "You did what I could not." And for a moment, the emptiness inside me is filled with something I never want to lose. Peace. Not the peace that comes from religion, but the peace that comes from truth. The peace of knowing that, even forgotten by men, my mother was remembered by God every day of her life. Today, I carry with me her mission to show that divine love never abandons anyone, that no institution can monopolize grace, and that the true temple is within us. No matter how many times religion has failed, God never fails. And He needs no intermediaries to hear the cry of a sincere heart. To every person who writes to me saying, "I've experienced something similar," I respond with the same advice my mother would give me. Don't keep what destroys you. Speak up, share it, release it, because the silence that protects the guilty is the same silence that sickens the victims. Healing begins when the truth is spoken out loud. I learned that faith without empathy is just doctrine, and doctrine without love is just control. Therefore, I no longer fear the judgment of men. I would rather be rejected by the church than applauded for lies. I would rather be at peace with God than conform to the system. Because in the end, what matters is not how many times we went to church, but how many times we opened our hearts to others. I look back and see that pain was a harsh but fair teacher. It taught me to differentiate between faith and fanaticism, spirituality and blind obedience, God and religion. And today, when someone asks me if I still believe, I smile and say, I believe more than ever, but in a different way. Now I believe freely. This video is my way of giving a voice to those who've never had the courage to speak out. It's also an invitation, a call, because all of us, at some point in our lives, must choose between the comfort of lies and the liberating pain of truth. And only those who choose the truth find the light. The faith I was once taught to defend with fear, I now defend with love. And this love is unbreakable, born of suffering, compassion, and awareness. No human power can silence a soul that has found meaning in divine love. If you've listened to me this far, know that this story is also a mirror. Perhaps you've experienced something similar. Perhaps you felt the same emptiness, the same doubt, the same loneliness. And if so, know that you're not alone. There is a multitude of hearts awakening, finding God outside the walls, discovering that the light shines brightest where there is truth. Therefore, I close with the same words that open my new path. God does not ask for silence. He asks for truth. And truth, when spoken with love, transforms into living faith. Comment, I'm awake. I want to know the truth. Leave your like if this story touched you. Subscribe for more real stories. And watch the next video. Another testimony from someone who also dared to tell the truth. Because true faith is not blind, it is compassionate. And when love replaces fear, silence ceases. This is what I learned from my mother. And this is what I want to leave the world, the certainty that faith is not measured by what you obey, but by what you love.